Welcome, everyone, to this first lecture on Plato's wonderful dialogue entitled the Meno. For the purposes of learning during this course, it'll be important for you to experiment with leaving behind everything you've learned or that you've been taught previously about Plato in past courses. Here, during this section of our course, the aim is to learn how to read a Platonic dialogue and then to consider how Plato's dialogues can help us think about what we're doing as teachers, what our students are doing as learners, and what we are doing, in fact, as human beings whenever we seek to know or whenever we inquire. Contrary to popular modern sentiment among educators that they've invented inquiry-based learning, let us never forget what Aristotle said about human beings at the beginning of his Metaphysics. All human beings desire to know. That is our nature. Our nature is to be inquisitive. Maybe you think it's a bit pompous of me to say that it will be important for you to forget everything you ever learned about Plato up to this point. By saying that, I don't mean that what I have to say is so profound or different. Indeed, whatever I think about Plato is largely irrelevant. But I want you very much to set yourself up to be able to be open to learn from Plato. And you can't do that if you harbor misconceptions about him. Plato is one of the best and smartest and most beautiful people you'll ever not meet. So, I'll repeat my request again. Forget whatever you've been taught thus far about Plato. More than likely, whatever you've learned about Plato and his theories has been unhelpful and misguided. I implore you, therefore, there is much unlearning that we must do in order to learn from Plato. For instance, you must forget what you've been told, perhaps, about Platonic dualism, about Plato's doctrine of the soul, or about his doctrine of forms or ideas. You must forget all the things you've heard from professors or on Wikipedia concerning Plato's supposed ambition to construct a vast educational program for elites and philosopher kings, about his affirmation of something akin to a caste system, and his desire to create different classes of human beings. Discard all the nonsense you've heard about how he's keen to biologically engineer human beings, or to ban poetry and music. In short, all the things that strike us when we're normally introduced to Plato's writings as novitiates as being most bizarre and offensive about Plato's texts. Indeed, if we have any respect at all for how insightful Plato is, we must reevaluate our quick dismissal of such things as ridiculous stupidities. I'd venture to say to you that the striking and ludicrous character of these doctrines is all the more reason not to suppose that Plato wrote them as doctrines or dogmas, or as though his objectives as a writer really were to strip children from their families, or to have men and women practice gymnastics in the nude together, and all the other fabulous things we read of in the Republic. No, these things are not Plato's doctrines, and we should not read them as though Plato intended them to be doctrines. They're intended rather to raise red flags for us as readers. Whenever we read Plato, and whenever something crazy like this appears in his text, we shouldn't think, what a crazy bastard! Rather, we should be aware that something has purposefully gone awry in the dialogues. Plato has a reason for including these wild statements and these bizarre ideas about education. Something has transpired, as it often does in our own chats with students in the living conversations Socrates has with his youthful interlocutors. Well, what is it? We're not meant to suppose that in these conversations, Socrates is offering us definitive answers to our questions or problems, we're certainly not meant to adopt the opinions of the others with whom Socrates converses either. In a Platonic dialogue, in short, we're not offered answers, but rather questions. We're drawn towards puzzlement and perplexity. Ideas and suppositions are meant to be taken apart and scrutinized for their truth and falsity. As wannabe teachers or teachers in training, we should be encouraged by this emphasis on questioning and seeking to know. Our most beautiful and sacred duty towards our students is not to teach them this or that science or art, although that certainly is part of our job as well, but rather to model for them and to invite them to participate in a kind of loving inquiry into what is. This loving inquiry is called philosophy. Now, please understand that Plato is not a salesman in any of his dialogues. He never writes with the seriousness of a John Dewey or of an education policy maker with a program for education. In his 7th letter, Plato actually remarks, this time in his own voice, that nothing he's ever written has ever been serious. That every one of his dialogues is fundamentally a form of play. This we must remember as we read him. And we too must be playful and enter that spirit of play in order to understand and to appreciate his writings. Hence, as you embark upon your reading of Plato's Meno, approach it therefore like you were reading a play, for it is indeed playful. Treat your reading of the dialogue as though you were reading one of Shakespeare's dramas, for they're very much on par with one another. Realize that we cannot understand any of the dialogues without engaging with them as dramas. Plato's plays are full of delightful and not so delightful characters. There are rich men and poor men. There are politicians and artists, lawyers, there's arms dealers, there's demagogues, and there are children, there are old men, mystical women, slaves, and lots of youth, lots of them teenagers. The plays feature a wide range of characters, real-life characters from history, movers and shakers, honest men as well as thugs and brigands, military men, ambitious youths, tyrants in the making, all real people who lived and who knew each other intimately in the small world of the ancient Greek city-state or polis. There are deep abiding friendships, and there are mere acquaintances, and there are dangerous enemies. And likewise, as you read, be aware that there is a setting for every play, and that time and place figure greatly in what is said. We need to pay attention to this time and place. A dialogue might, for instance, occur in honor of a host's victory in tragic contests. It might occur while Socrates is on his way to court to be tried of a capital crime. Or it might happen at night after a festival. Some dialogues might transpire long after original events as a kind of recounting of what happened or what was said in a long ago conversation. Mostly all the dialogues happen within the city, but one happens in the countryside. Some dialogues transpire in Socrates' youth, some during his old age and at the end of his life. Some happen while the other characters are themselves young. Others feature that same character after he's grown older and matured. Some dialogues happen on the brink of war and in a time of deadly decision-making. Others happen in times of peace. Depending on who is present and what is the situation, different things will be said. Different matters will be discussed. Different questions will be of most interest to the parties involved. The needs, desires, and abilities of interlocutors will differ. Some conversants will be open-minded and inquisitive. Others, very much the opposite. Still, others may be very skilled speakers, full of the desire to contend and dispute without any interest in inquiring into truth, but solely desirous for power or victory. Some proclaim themselves to be teachers with valuable skills and knowledge that deserves remuneration from fathers willing to pay for their sons to be educated by them. Hence, the matter of situation, circumstance, and interest, all these things must figure into understanding of a Platonic dialogue. Now, here's a general rule that I offer each of you that might offend you, but I'm going to say it anyway. As you read Plato, or Shakespeare for that matter, always assume that the author is correct. When you encounter a difficulty in Plato's dialogues, something with which you strongly disagree, don't jump to the conclusion that Plato was simply an idiot, or that he wasn't sufficiently progressive, that he lacks the benefit of our modern understanding, or that he's hobbled in some way by the prejudices and beliefs rampant in his own times. Rather, when you come across something outlandish in Plato, recognize that here the poet, and Plato the philosopher is most certainly a poet, here the poet is challenging you and inviting you to struggle. He's asked you at this point to become bothered and uncomfortable with something he has written. He wants you to inquire more. Do not suppose that because X is said by a character in his dialogues, that Plato therefore believes X. Rather, try to figure out by reading and rereading carefully and through cultivating sensitivity to the dialogic form, just what is the purpose of being served here, in this place, in the dialogue. Such inquisitive and sleuth-like practices will transform your reading practices and deepen your own engagement in Plato's texts. Finally, before we begin the Meno, let me provide you with one more outlandish bit of advice that I have stolen from the great political philosopher and interpreter of Plato, Leo Strauss. Strauss insists upon the logographic necessity of Plato's writing. The logographic necessity. That means, essentially, that every single word of Plato's text is important. That Plato isn't a sloppy writer, that he isn't just filling pages, and that we cannot take any word that he has written for granted. Every single word Plato has recorded on the page is like a note in a symphony by a great composer. There's no filler here, and every note is somehow related to the overall work, just as every word of Plato's we must savor and contemplate in order to draw out the vision of the overall dialogue. Now, let's begin reading Plato's Meno by starting at the beginning. So there are a number of players in the Meno. One with whom all of you, I'm sure, are familiar is Socrates. The literal meaning of Socrates' name is sure strength, or perhaps saving strength. Socrates, we know, was executed in 399 BC at around the age of 70, making his birth date somewhere around 469 BC, or a decade after Athens turned back the second and last great Persian invasion at Salamis, and 2 decades after Marathon. He lived out his youth in the golden age of ancient Greece. The great writers of tragedy like Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides were his contemporaries, as were the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. Philosophers like Meno, Parmenides, Empedocles, and Anaxagoras were also alive during his own time. We're not told what's the precise setting for the Meno. R.E. Allen, the translator of our version of the text, suggests that the dialogue perhaps occurs in the Lyceum, or the wrestling school, a place where it would be easy to find lots of sand to draw the mathematical figures that are prominent in this story. Many dialogues of Plato, in fact, occur in wrestling schools. Indeed, there's a kind of metaphoric association here between physical wrestling contests on the one hand and contests of wit or wrestling with the problem on the other. The dramatic date for the Meno is placed sometime after the fall of the 30 tyrants in 403 BC, when democracy has been restored in Athens, but before 401 BC, when Meno, the character, would have left Greece for his military service in Persia. At the time of this dialogue, Meno himself would have been about 18 years old. Socrates would have been, by my feeble calculations, about 67 years old. So, the dialogue takes place dramatically 3 or so years before Socrates is put to death for corrupting the youth and for introducing false gods into the city. As you read this dialogue, it's good to remember that one of the interlocutors, a man named Anytus, was among the primary accusers of Socrates. It is in part thanks to his efforts that Socrates, the teacher, or corrupter of youth, is later executed. Plato would have been around 26 years old at the dramatic time of the Meno. We know a little about Meno, the historical figure, mostly from Xenophon's characterization of him in his personal memoir of adventure entitled The Persian Expedition. We know, for instance, that Meno was not an Athenian citizen, but rather from Thessaly. Hence, he's a foreign visitor to Athens when we meet him in Plato's dialogues. We know also that Meno was around 20 years old when he became a commander of Greek mercenary forces in the service of Cyrus of Persia, that same Cyrus who led a coup d'etat against his elder brother and king of Persia, Artaxerxes. Xenophon, who also fought in this mercenary army for Cyrus, writes scathingly of Meno as a liar and a reprobate, both full of greed and faithlessness. In Plato's dialogue, however, Meno doesn't seem all bad. Indeed, the Platonic dialogue named after him transpires dramatically at least a couple years before Meno's military involvement in Persia. Here in Plato's writings, Meno is described simply as a good-looking and somewhat spoiled young man. He's stubborn in his desire to keep control over the direction of the conversation with Socrates. Perhaps, in a way, his name Meno, which literally means to stay, remain, or abide, says something about his stubbornness, or perhaps his persistence in the pursuit of his interests and ambitions. And Meno certainly is ambitious. He is by disposition drawn strongly to the sophist Gorgias, particularly by the sophist's claim to be able to make his students into powerful, effective speakers, able to win in political debates and in courts of law, to be successful in any or all areas of interest to them, but most particularly in politics. And Meno's ambitions gravitate precisely in these directions. He's attracted most definitely to money, to power, to honors, high office, and glory. On this, both Plato and Xenophon agree. Meno definitely wants to be somebody. In the future, Meno's adventuresome desires appear to have gotten the better of him, unfortunately, for years later, after the death of Cyrus, Meno's own soldiers betrayed him. He was sent to the Persian court at Babylon, suspected of treachery, where he was imprisoned for a year, and finally put to death by impalement. Being a foreigner in Athens, Meno was visiting the city as a house guest of Anytus, a local tanner risen to some stature in the city as a wealthy man and a democratic leader. In 409 BC, maybe 7 years prior to the dramatic date for this dialogue, Anytus failed badly in his role as an Athenian general. He didn't manage to prevent the Athenian loss of Pylos to the Spartans. The Athenians subsequently brought him to court for his ineptitude, but Anytus escaped punishment by bribing the entire jury using his resources from his vast inheritance. Well, this, by the way, is an important point of contrast with Socrates at his own trial, as we'll see. For Socrates, unlike Anytus, refuses to resort to lies or bribery or pity or any sort of wily ways that might compromise the truth of his defense. It's also noteworthy that in 402, the same date as the dramatic time for the Meno, Socrates, a prominent Athenian politician and rhetorician who we will have occasion to discuss later on in this course, publicly praised Anytus as an exemplary supporter of Athenian democracy. Interestingly, Socrates goes so far as to credit Anytus as one not at all prone to political vendettas. Strange, considering that only a few years later, Anytus would launch capital accusations against Socrates that would result in his execution by hemlock. Traditions about Anytus's own untimely demise after the death of Socrates are uncertain. Some say he was stoned to death without public trial by angry Athenians, still upset by Socrates' execution. Others say he was banished from the city. Others say he was neither killed nor banished, so nobody really knows. The other character who appears in this dialogue is the nameless slave boy. First, let it be known that by portraying a slave in his dialogues, Plato is not thereby condoning injustice or saying, "Hooray for slavery!" Some rather distinguished people actually suppose such things, believe it or not. So I thought I might mention it here in case there are any misunderstandings. Rather, Plato portrays the slave boy in question as very bright and thoughtful, but really as intensely human and open-minded, as any of our own students or future students might ever be. Indeed, the fact that the boy who is summoned to participate in dialectical inquiries is a slave provides an interesting contrast to the accusations made by men like John Dewey much later in educational thought that the Greek philosophers, and Plato in particular, espoused elitist conceptions about education, that the leisured pursuit of learning they practiced was by nature above and beyond the ordinary capacities and abilities of most human beings. Dewey should have read his Plato more carefully. Indeed, that's what we're intent upon doing in this course, as we develop our own sense of ourselves as teachers. The use of the word boy is particularly important for our purposes as teachers in training. In Greek, the word for boy is pais. A boy, or pais, is somebody who has not yet reached the age of puberty. So, whereas the majority of the dialogue is with a youth, or neos, a large portion of it transpires with a prepubescent child. Also of interest to us as teachers is how the Greek word for education, paideia, is itself related to the root word for child being pais. Now to the dialogue. We meet the characters Meno and Socrates all of a sudden, without introduction, and in the midst of a conversation already begun. Perhaps we're like fellow wrestlers listening in on a verbal wrestling match at the Lyceum. At any rate, Meno is asking whether virtue is taught, or whether it's acquired by practice, or perhaps whether it's present in some people by nature. Socrates immediately points out how Meno needs to slow down a wee bit. How can we ask such questions when we don't even know what virtue is? Aren't we jumping the gun here? Aren't we presuming to know things that we don't know? Meno, as a foreigner, has already heard beforehand all the gossip about Socrates' famous ironic speech about his claiming not to know anything, but really secretly knowing exactly what's what. And then, his way of ensnaring unsuspecting interlocutors in the clutches of his arguments, right? He knows all about these rumors. Such rumors about Socrates, therefore, make Meno suspicious of Socrates. Of course you know what virtue is, Socrates. Or at least you must have heard about the nature of virtue from Gorgias. Now, for those of you new to all things ancient and Greek, Gorgias is what we call a sophist. In Greek, the word sophist literally means wise one. I prefer the term wise guy, however, because it gets better at the flavor of the sophist's claim to knowledge. And also, it helps us to understand the general mistrust among the Athenians at the time of the sophists. The sophists, it should be noted, were not purveyors of specific knowledge in the arts or sciences. Sophists were rather more like hired guns. They were traveling teachers, mostly foreign, who wandered the ancient world offering to teach the sons of any fathers who could pay the big bucks how to speak effectively in the law courts and in political assemblies. The art of rhetoric, or the making of public speeches in order to persuade others to do your bidding, was highly valued in the ancient world. It was seen as the educational linchpin for any kind of worldly success that a man's sons might enjoy. Men and sons who were not born into the old power structures as members of the aristocracy, but who rather, as outsiders, through sweat and toil and competition, through scrimping and saving, might afford an education that in turn would open the floodgates of success, money, fame, influence, in short, the road to happiness through power. Meno adores Gorgias, for Gorgias, he suggests, claims to know, as a wise man, what is the nature of virtue, and Meno, desirous of acclaim and honors, certainly would like to be able to lay claim to being himself esteemed for virtue, if only somebody could teach him. Enticed by Meno's excited claims about Gorgias, Socrates asks him to elaborate and to offer for examination what is precisely the sophist's definition of virtue. Happy to oblige, Meno tells Socrates that virtue is a case-specific excellence. That is, there is a virtue that is specific to being an adult male. There is virtue that is appropriate for women, for boys and for girls, for old men, for freemen, for slaves, and so on. Socrates then points out a problem that we can easily detect in such an answer to the question of what is virtue. Namely, that Meno has responded with a litany of kinds of virtue, without saying what virtue is. It's kind of like when somebody asks you what a car is, and you say it's a Maserati. Well, that's a kind of car, right? It's not a definition of what a car is. So what is a car? The nature of virtue has to be what all these various virtues have in common. When pressed through discussion, through question and answer to this point of agreement, Meno's true colors show through rather nicely. The heart of the matter, the thing that he really wants virtue to be, and that he therefore stresses ought to be central component of any virtue worthy of the name, is the ability to rule mankind. Now, we see something of the tyrannic spirit inhabiting Meno's soul, eh? Now, we see just what Xenophon was talking about in his scathing report of Meno. The attractive, good-natured, honor-loving youth is himself susceptible to tyrannic desires that may easily be fed by his parents' aspirations for him or by his own aspirations when encouraged by a wise guy teacher unlike the philosopher, the wise guy claims to know precisely what is virtue and how to teach his students to get what they want, namely, the power to accomplish what they themselves have come to suppose is the key to their own happiness and the acquisition of their own heart's desires. Is this what education is all about? Finding out what you want and what you desire most deeply? Finding a teacher who can help you get it by enabling you with the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes necessary to accomplish your goals and to follow your dreams? This, at least, is the sophist brand of education. Is it ours? Is it yours? Clearly doesn't sit well with Socrates. Returning to Meno's frank response that virtue is nothing but the ability to rule mankind, Socrates makes short work of this contention. What then? Does this speak to the virtue of a child, as you mentioned before? Or how about a slave? Surely not. And then, is ruling all that matters? Aren't some rulers horrible and others good? Are we not to add justly or unjustly to when we speak about ruling? Well, Meno agrees at this point that justice is virtue. But Socrates then responds with the question, is justice virtue? Or is it a virtue? That is, aren't there other virtues besides justice? And Meno naturally replies that, yes, there are indeed other virtues like temperance or sound-mindedness, like wisdom and magnificence. The word there is megalopropeia, or the disposition to do great things. But now, Socrates once again points out how we're back to square one. In looking for the one thing common to all virtue, we've just ended up finding all kinds of examples of different types of virtue all over again. What seems to be tripping them up is, what is the nature of a definition? When, as teachers, we ask our own students for definitions of things, will they be able to tell the difference between a definition and offering examples? This is the problem Socrates is encountering with Meno. In order to clarify, Socrates tries to think of another example of creating definitions. Maybe one of the easiest places to turn is mathematics, and geometry in particular. After all, the teaching of mathematics and geometry is a staple in all paideia, both ancient and modern. So, Socrates begins to discuss with Meno about the nature of figure. What is figure? Is figure the same as roundness, for instance? Certainly some figures are round, but some are not, right? Some might be quite straight-sided, but not all are straight-sided. So a definition of figure has to apply in all cases in which we deal with figure. Socrates then asks Meno to try his hand at creating such a definition of figure, but Meno, like his name suggests, as the one who remains or stays put, resists moving inquisitively in this direction with Socrates. As a student, Meno isn't exactly cooperative now. He wants what he wants, and he sees clearly that Socrates isn't going to take him on a beeline straight towards the object of his own desires, that big honeypot of world domination. Nope. He pouts at Socrates. Why don't you just do it yourself? Where Socrates the philosopher is interested in questioning, or in the question of what is, in his inquiries, the Greek word for inquiry here is zetesis, by the way, are directed at the heart of things. Meno isn't at all interested in knowing what is. After all, what if, in finding out the nature of virtue, he were suddenly to realize that all the deep desires he harbors,
All his ambitions and his thirst for power are, in fact, tainted by ignorance and injustice and vice. Wouldn't that ruin his day? Meno wants what he wants, and that's all that he wants. And in such a situation, what is a teacher to do? As teachers, what is our responsibility towards our students in pressing them to evaluate their own stated goals, their aspirations, their dreams and desires, the things they value most, the pursuits that engage them most? How many parents would say it's our place to encourage students to question these goals that have been inculcated on them and that engage them or that light them up and get them moving in a manner that mimics deep learning? For it is most certainly the case that such students are engaged, no? Socrates is so frequently accused of being hubristic in the dialogue, being prideful, right? Well, is Socrates inappropriately overstepping a line when he pressures Meno here to turn away from his pursuit of the fleeting things of desire and to turn towards, and the Greek word for this motion is periagogé, towards what is? Or is he doing his duty as one who pursues truth and as one who would invite and lead others into the life in pursuit of truth? Incidentally, have you ever yourself had much experience of what happens to teachers who prod their students in this way? If you haven't, then perhaps if ever you decide to follow Socrates as you proceed into your career, you'll find one day that indeed students can become pretty hostile to anyone who asks such questions, or would have students ask such questions regarding the precious things upon which they have staked their entire identity, those goals, aspirations, and dreams they harbor for themselves. Such inquiries can most certainly be a sensitive subject in your classrooms, and they may lead you into contentions and wrestling matches that do not necessarily end with you drinking hemlock, but nonetheless require considerable courage on your part to endure some of the resistance and wrath you'll face as a philosophizing teacher. Facing Meno's unwillingness to engage in dialectics at this point, Socrates says, okay, if I proceed on my own in a kind of think aloud that models for you what such a dialogue might look like, and if I manage in the process to come up with a workable definition of figure, then can we get back to the business of seeking to know what is virtue? Meno says, yeah, okay, sure, why not? Socrates then offers Meno a definition of figure as whatever follows color. That is, imagine a color. Now, the boundaries of that color, where it ends around the edges, demarcate the entire figure. Simple enough, right? Wrong. Meno, being clever at this point, says, okay, then, what about color? What if I said I don't know what you mean by color, huh? If I don't know what color is, then your definition of figure isn't going to work. Ooh, snap! To which Socrates replies with an important distinction between heuristical and dialectical argumentation. Now, this distinction is very important for us to learn about, ladies and gentlemen. This distinction between heuristical and dialectical argumentation. See, Socrates was accused by Anytus and Meletus and a whole raft of unknown past accusers, by gossipers and innuendo, of being a sophist himself. The very best example and the most entertaining of such accusations is chronicled in the comic poet Aristophanes' ancient play, The Clouds. I say you should read that sometime when you get a chance.
There Socrates is portrayed as a ridiculous man who corrupts the youth of Athens by teaching them how to undo any argument, how to make the weaker argument into the stronger one, and how to make the unjust argument prevail over the just one, thereby subverting the traditions and evaluations of the city in favor of some new gods that are the creations of his own silly ideas. What sophists are essentially is arguers. Very good and tricksy arguers, as Gollum would say. They can argue anything on any side, taking it down, building it up, making it win, making it fail, all depending on their own whims, but completely without any regard for what is best, what is just, or what is true. The sophist has much in common with the champion wrestler, where the wrestler knows all the grappling and throwing techniques and has mastered them in such a way as to bring any opponent down in the sand, so too does the sophist know the rhetorical tricks to bring down any opponent to his knees in a battle of wits. The champion wrestler crushes his opponent to win the laurels of victory. And victory in competition is his sole purpose. So too with the sophist. He is not concerned to unfurl the truth in his opponent's argument, nor does he care to weed out the falsehoods in his own. There is no process of taking up. The Greek word here, by the way, is anairesis. Taking up the truth discovered through conversation towards their ground in the truth itself, and of leaving behind what is not true. There is only the desire to destroy one's opponent. There is only power and victory. This sort of argumentation or quarrelsomeness in speech is referred to as eristic. The word eristic is derived from the Greek word eris, which also doubles as the name for the ancient Greek goddess of strife. Now, listen carefully, because what I'm about to say, if you learn it now, will protect you from countless stupidities, misconceptions, and downright lies, often repeated even to this day, about philosophers and philosophy. The thing to note here is that the philosopher kind of looks like a sophist, doesn't he? He argues, he engages in contentious debate and dialogue. Both men might talk to young students, for instance, and both might ask questions that undercut some of their students' deeply held views on things, too. And also the views of their parents, eh? Like the sophist, the philosopher also asks questions. And he gives answers when they're requested. And he's no dummy either. He knows how to speak. He's very likely familiar with the same formalities of speaking that the sophist knows. Both men can, when pressed, write a speech or give a speech. And surely both men should be able to speak in a court of law if it ever comes to that. But just because they look similar, and just because they sound similar, does not mean they're the same. This must be understood. This is what is most certainly not understood by very, very many people. What's the difference? Well, the difference between the philosopher and the sophist is not at the surface level of the techniques they use or the speaking forms that they employ, but rather lies in their hearts. It is the spirit in which they take up disputation, and the Greek word for disputation here is elenchus. It is the spirit in which they speak, in which they act, and in which they inquire. The sophist's heuristic may look or sound very much like the philosopher's dialectic, but the difference is precisely this. Whereas the aim of heuristic is simply to tear down or destroy whatever is said, or conversely, to build up whatever is said in order to gain a victory, The aim of dialectic is rather to put all selfish or private ends aside, to let fall away all concerns with lesser matters, and to get at the truth. For the truth is the image of being in the realm of the intellect. Put another way, it's the manner in which the mind participates in knowledge of being, or of what is. Truth is dependent, after all, upon what is. Something is true because it says what is. And philosophers seek to know being as such, or what is. They seek to know it, and their search is a loving one. Whenever you, as a teacher, seek to know the being of another, when you seek to know others through loving them, when you enter into communion with them and are able truly to see them for who they are, you are, surprise, being something of a philosopher. Hooray! Now, the philosopher's love for being, his quest to know being as such, the knowledge of which is wisdom, or Sophia, is precisely the spirit that distinguishes whatever the philosopher is doing from what the sophist does through his heuristic. Philosophy is the genuine spirit of dialectical inquiry in its purest and most beautiful form. And contrary to what Dewey will teach you about philosophers and philosophy and the exercise of leisure in the pursuit of wisdom, this spirit is not elitist or anti-democratic. It is not the sole prerogative of a gentry few. It's open to everyone. Witness how Socrates spoke to and inquired with everyone he met, no matter what their age, their social status, their occupation, their sex, or their national identity. Indeed, Socrates is a living example of the spirit of philosophy and of dialectic that, unlike heuristic, does not just seek out power or victory, but rather seeks to know what is, taking whatever is said, analyzing it for its truth content, allowing whatever is untrue to fall away like so much chaff, but holding on to whatever is true, and taking that up towards a better, more perfect understanding, and a more beautiful vision of what is best. So, returning then to the Meno. Socrates responds to Meno's quip about color, and how the fact that Socrates' definition implies one already knows what it is. Meno's taunt here is heuristic in nature. It is the trick of a sophist in spirit, because he uses it to destroy any attempts that they might make together to offer up a workable understanding of what is figure. Essentially, Meno's sophistry implies that to offer a definition of anything at all is impossible, because that would require definitions of each word or concept referred to in each definition, and then the definitions within each of those definitions, and so on, and down we go in an infinite regress. In other words, Meno's taunt is a good example of the sophist's heuristic, because it only destroys to win. It does nothing to edify or to build up our understanding of what is true. It rather suggests that no knowledge of truth is possible at all. It sucks all the life out of genuine inquiry. It pulls the mind and the heart into a despairing morass, and it shuts down on the spirit of the search. How bitter a victory. Socrates points out the heuristic nature of Meno's taunt to him, but he stops short of accusing Meno of sophistry. After all, this is a polite conversation, not a public harangue. It is, more importantly, a conversation between friends. Indeed, philosophy is literally friendship with wisdom, and it therefore must always be approached with the spirit of friendship, never with heuristic contentiousness. And so Socrates turns gently aside these difficulties in his response to the spirit of resistance he detects in Meno. Socrates
redirects his efforts to lead Meno by offering up a second definition of figure that is equally as workable as the first one, looking rather for a pragmatic means of establishing agreement with his young interlocutor in the process. Now, rather than resisting, Meno speaks his approval of considering a figure as that in which a solid terminates. See how Socrates demonstrates the teacher's flexibility here in providing a number of ways of approaching a problem in order to overcome resistances? Are you able to approach a problem from a number of different directions as a teacher? As a learner? As an inquirer? This is all part of effective teacher practice. Meno, the one who stays put and resists, has here made some headway with Socrates. And yet, he's still fixed upon the notion of color, which Socrates handily left behind by offering Meno a second definition that didn't rely on color for its explanatory power. Regardless, Meno still demands from him a definition of color, even though they've moved beyond this problem. At this point, Socrates points out playfully to Meno how his own stubborn pride, his self-regard, or his hubris is getting in the way of his learning. Indeed, this element of pride, hubris, or self-concern distinguishes the sophist's heuristical pursuits from those of the philosopher most especially. For where the sophist manipulates words, does battle, and engages in disputation for the gratification of his various desires, ambitions, and disparate finite goals, the philosopher lets go of all such private or self-centered concerns, putting even himself aside in lieu of his interests in the greatest good that transcends all such things as trifles. The philosopher is willing to relinquish every other good in search of the most sublime object of his affections, namely that great good of wisdom, or knowing what truly is. Moreover, unlike Meno, the philosopher seeks out wisdom, or sophia, as highest of all virtues, not in order to reap its benefits or rewards, to gain money, success, acclaim, or power, but simply for its own sake. All selfish ends are put aside by the genuine lover of wisdom. So Socrates' gentle teasing of Meno at this point regarding his outrageous pride, while friendly, also speaks a deeper truth for us to consider. Unlike Meno the resistor, Socrates shows his willingness to move towards his student and his pliability as an interlocutor in the processes of inquiry. Fine! Meno wants to know about color? It's not exactly relevant anymore, but let's talk about and explore color. Socrates has at this point espied Meno's point of resistance here. He won't recollect what Gorgias said about virtue. But more than this, he won't recollect at all. This is the first time the word recollection or anamnesis appears in Plato's Meno. This word is to become very important in the dialogue, as we shall see. In order to engage his youthful interlocutor in such recollections, Socrates draws upon theories of color with which Meno would already have some familiarity and some level of acceptance, seeing as they are in part associated with the teachings of Gorgias. Notice how Socrates here draws upon his student's prior knowledge, his interests, and his experiences. In short order, Socrates has come to assess the character of his interlocutor. He has come to see what makes Meno tick. Socrates is sensitive, and he's a masterful listener, as well as being a wonderful conversationalist. Enthused by Gorgias' pontifications on color and effluences, Meno praises Socrates' reference to them, saying, Socrates, I think you've found an answer that is simply superb. Here, all of Meno's earlier resistance to definition and to the possibility of giving definitions, and therefore also the possibility of seeking to know what a thing is, has disappeared in one fell swoop. Mind you, Socrates harbors no illusions about the truth of Gorgias's definition. He remarks that very likely Meno approves of it simply because it's more like the sort of ornate things he's used to hearing, having associated with sophists for so long. Moreover, Socrates laments that Meno seems unwilling to follow him into deeper mysteries of philosophic inquiry. Meno was unwilling to engage in the spirit of celebration that lies at the core of philosophizing and that animates philosophic inquiry. Meno seems always to want to leave off from digging deeper. He continually shirks the opportunity to gaze upon being itself, eluding Socrates' invitations to become initiated into such mysteries. Nonetheless, after giving Meno something of a Gorgiac display, Socrates has prepared Meno to once again engage in further investigations as to the nature of virtue. A small victory, at least.